So today we are going to take an in-depth look at aftermarket brake pads. Is there really any difference between a $40 brake pad and a $100 brake pad? So looking at all the different brake pads I have here on the bench, these are what we're going to take a look at in this video. So I have two different pads from Raybestos, I have two different pads from Bosch, I have two different pads from AC Delco, I have two different pads from PowerStop, and finally I have two different pads from Wagner. In addition to those name brands that I just mentioned, as a control, I also went out and I bought the OEM GM genuine brake pads that came on the vehicle that we're going to be dealing with in this video. It just so happens that the GM genuine brake pads, which are in fact different from the AC Delco pads, the GM genuine pad is made by Akebono. So if you guys wonder how Akebono brake pads compare to what I have sitting here on the bench, well, the GM genuine pad that is going to be used as a control, that what came factory on this car, is an Akebono brake pad. Now, in addition to all of these different pads here, I also went out and I bought the absolute cheapest brake pads that I could get my hands on. They're simply marked ceramic, and they came from a company called AutoShack. We're going to see how a $20 brake pad compares to a $100 GM genuine brake pad. Is there really any difference performance-wise between these two pads? Now, in addition to that, guys, we're going to take a look at things like stopping distance, initial bite. We're also going to take a look at the amount of dust that they produce, and I'm going to see how corrosion resistant they are, because one of the big problems that guys in the north like myself have is the backing plates on these brake pads will develop rust, and eventually the friction material will actually just fall off the backing plate due to rust issues. So when I test the corrosion resistance, hopefully that'll give us insights as to how durable these pads are in a corrosive environment. Now, quick note about all the pads that are going to be in this video, guys. All the pads in this video are labeled ceramic pads by their manufacturer. I was not able to find any sort of organic or metallic pads for this particular vehicle that we're dealing with in this video. Now, as far as the vehicle I'm going to be testing with in this video, this is going to be a 2014 Chevy Cruze featuring the fantastic plastic 1.4 liter turbo engine, and this has the smaller of the two factory GM brake options. I believe this has like a 10.8 inch front rotor, and then it also features rear drums. So this is the vehicle I'm going to be testing with. Now, I've also made some modifications to this vehicle. So if you come down here and you look at this driver's side front wheel, if you look in there, you can just see I have installed a stainless steel fitting and a braided stainless steel line into the bleeder port of the driver's side front caliper. The reason for this is this stainless steel line comes up into the engine compartment and it goes to this sensor. So that sensor there is wired directly to the front brake caliper. So then I am able to get brake pressure information for each set of brake pads that we're going to test with. The information from this sensor comes over here to a Banks module that then goes inside the car to a Banks iDash. So if I start the car up, wait for the screen to boot up, flip my page over here, and if you look down at the bottom there, I have brake pressure. This is the information from that sensor. So I have the vehicle speed listed there. The brake pressure switch is down below that. It's inactive right now. And then below that is the brake pressure. So if I step on the brake, you can see the brake pedal switch goes active. The brake pressure also registers on the gauge. And if I do a panic stop and really lay into the brakes, you can read the pressure in PSI that is going into the piston in that front brake caliper. So now we'll be able to see exactly how much pressure I am applying to the brake pedal in order to get each one of these stops in the video. So the first thing that I wanted to look at with all of these pads is I wanted to see like what's included in quote unquote a pad kit. You know, does it come with the hardware? Does it come with grease? Is there any other like ancillary things that are included with any one of these kits versus some of the others? And the other thing that I wanted to take a look at is the overall construction. I understand, you know, this is all of the same fitment, right? These all fit the exact same year, make, and model of vehicle, but when you really start looking at like the thickness of the friction material, thickness of the backing plate, and overall construction, are there really any differences here? So taking a look at all the pads I have laid out here on the bench, I have them all in order of what they include. So taking a look at the most complete kit down here on the left, this is going to be the PowerStop Z23 carbon fiber ceramic kit. This includes the pads, the hardware, it also includes the boots for the slide pins, and it also includes the grease for the caliper. This is by far and away the most complete kit here, but unfortunately, the boots for the slide pins do not fit the vehicle that the rest of the kit was actually designed for. If you take the boots from the PowerStop kit and you compare it side by side with the boots that come on this car from the factory, you can see the design is totally different, and there's no way that I can see that these will attach the same way as the factory ones will. It's simply not possible. So the fact that the PowerStop kit includes the boots in my situation is frankly irrelevant because the boots don't actually fit. So moving over here to the Bosch Blue. The Bosch Blue includes the pad, the hardware, grease, and it also comes with a rag. This is the only one in the kit that had a rag in the box. So, moving over to the right further, the pads that you see here are going to be the AC Delco, the Wagner OEX, the Wagner QS, and the Bosch Quiet Cast, and then finally the Auto Shacks down at the bottom, the no-name Amazon pads. All of these include grease, hardware, and the pad. That's pretty standard for what you're going to find in most of these kits. The exception to that is going to be these here. So these kits on this stack simply only include the hardware and the pad. There is no grease, there's no boots. What you see is what you get. So that's going to be the PowerStop ceramic, the Z17, the AC Delco Advantage. This is their lower tier AC Delco pad. The Element 3 from Raybestos, the MGD or R line from Raybestos, and then finally the most expensive pads here, the AC Delco or GM Genuine pads made by Akebono, simply only give you the hardware and the pad. There is no grease included in any of these kits. So after I looked at what each kit sort of contained, I then took the pad out of each kit and just took a bunch of measurements of the pad and the backing plate itself to try and see, is there really any difference between, again, that high-end pad and the low-end pad? And what I ended up finding, believe it or not, was the thinnest pad here that had the least amount of friction material on it was the Wagner OEX pad. The pad that had the most friction material on it was the Auto Shack $20 Amazon pad. That had the thickest friction material on it. And the way that that Auto Shack pad was able to have more friction material than a lot of the other ones in the test was, believe it or not, they used a thinner backing plate, which sort of makes sense. It probably is a cost play. You know, that metal backing plate is probably one of the more expensive pieces in that $20 brake kit. So if you make the backing plate thinner, well, it's going to cut some cost out, and you just give a little bit extra friction material to the customer, and then that makes up the difference. The friction material is probably cheaper than the backing plate, in all honesty. So when I laid the Wagner OEX pad side by side with the Auto Shack pad, it was blatantly obvious that the Wagner pad was much thinner than that Auto Shack pad. The only other thing that I can really say is there are some differences in the coatings that they apply to the pads themselves, which when we get into the corrosion testing a little bit later on in the video, we'll be able to test, you know, those different coatings that they're putting on the pad just to see how well they're able to resist corrosion. One other thing worth noting is every pad here, with the exception of the Wagner OEX pad, is bonded to the backing plate. So that means the friction material is glued to the backing plate, and that is how the friction material is adhered to the backing plate, is simply with glue. The Wagner OEX pad is the only pad here that has a mechanical attachment. So meaning it has like a bunch of fingers in the backing plate that they actually press the friction material onto those fingers and glue it to try and keep that friction material from falling off the backing plate. Like I said, you know, super common problem up north if you get some rust. The other thing that the Wagner OEX pads have is they have a galvanized coating allegedly on the pads. We'll test that when we get to the corrosion portion of the video. But by and large, as you would imagine, if you buy a bunch of different brake pads for the exact same application, they're gonna be pretty darn similar to one another. Now, the unfortunate reality of doing a video like this is, well, at a certain point, you've got to do 11 different brake jobs to the same car. So that is the point that I'm at right now. Good news is I'm getting really, really good at doing brake jobs on a Chevy Cruze. But for what it's worth, I would appreciate it if you guys would go down in the comment section. And first of all, let me know, like, I don't have any long-term experience with any of these pads, right? I'm gonna run each one of these pads for about 50 miles. So I understand this is not a long-term test. This is simply to try and get you guys some information on stopping distance, things like corrosion resistance, and hopefully that can give insights into their overall longevity. But the thing is, guys, like I said, I'm only running these pads for about 50 miles. And because of that, well, I don't have any long-term data to be able to present you guys. The thing is, if you do the math, you know, I'm running each one of these pads for 50 miles times 11 pads. That means I'm putting 600 miles on this car just to get you guys this information. Now, I understand 600 miles divided out by 11 different pads isn't a ton for each pad, but it's simply not feasible to try and give you guys long-term insight as to the lifespan of each one of these pads, because for one guy to do all of that, it's ridiculous. So I'm hoping you guys will go down in that comment section and just give me and the internet some insight as to the amount of success that you've had with certain brands of pad, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what do you use in your shop if you guys own a shop. But at any rate, interact with this video in some way, shape, or form, because as you guys can see here, I've got this side almost torn down, but I'm getting really, really good at doing Chevy Cruze brake jobs. So each set of pads is gonna get a brand new rotor, so there isn't gonna be any cross-contamination from any of the different pads. One thing I am gonna do just to try and save myself some time is I'm using the exact same hardware for each pad. I'm just cleaning everything off with brake clean, slapping a new set of pads and rotors on the whole setup, and sending it on its way. So after I got a fresh set of pads and rotors on the car, well, it was time to go out and actually start doing some brake testing. Now, one thing I did before I started any type of brake testing was I actually bedded in the pads to the rotor with 15 firm stops from 30 miles an hour, one right after another. Just firm stop, get the car right back up to 30 miles an hour and stop, and get it right back to 30 miles an hour and stop. I did not come to a complete stop, but I would get the vehicle down to about roughly 5 miles an hour or so, and then re-accelerate to 30 and just do that 15 times over and over and over again. The reason that I did that is bedding in a set of pads to the rotor transfers some of that pad material to the rotor, and that is going to give me an accurate representation of the overall stopping distance with each one of these pads. The thing is, if I don't bed in the pads, there may be differences in the stopping distance because the pads were not bedded in correctly. So I did bed in the pads. Now, as far as information on the test loop that each pad was driven on, all of these pads were driven on the exact same test loop. That test loop was roughly about 50 miles, and it featured 12 stop signs, 4 traffic lights. And what you have to understand about this test loop is I cannot account for things like traffic, right? So if somebody's turning right or left in front of me, naturally I have to brake for that. So I tried to keep the number of stops as consistent as possible, but unfortunately, You know, if the light's green when I'm coming up to a traffic light, I'm gonna roll through it. I'm not gonna stop at a green light. Just like if there's somebody turning left or right in front of me, I have to slow down for that. And naturally, I can't account for things like that, but I tried to control the number of brake applications as much as humanly possible on this 50-mile test loop. Now, at the halfway point in this test loop, I performed 5 consecutive panic stops from 50 miles an hour with each one of these pads. So what I would do is I would get the vehicle up to 50 miles an hour, perform a panic stop, immediately put the car in park, get out, measure it, write down the distance, get back in the car and do it again. So there was probably like a minute or so between each panic stop, but overall, this is a very, very taxing test for these pads, because think about it. When was the last time you took your daily driven vehicle and panic stopped it 5 times in a row? The next thing I did while the brake rotors were still hot is I wanted to get some tip-in information. So going back to what I was saying earlier on in the video, I wanted to see if there was any difference at light pedal pressure. Is there any difference in the amount of friction between one set of pads and another? So if I keep the pedal pressure consistent, is there any difference in the stopping distance? Because I have that sensor in the caliper. What I did was I tried to hold the brake pedal at 350 PSI of caliper pressure, and then I went out and I measured the stopping distance with a hot rotor. After I measured the hot tip-in distance, I then drove, the 25 miles back home, which gave the brakes time to cool down as I drove normally. And then when I got close to my house, I performed 3 more tip-in stops, so that light pedal pressure at roughly 350 PSI from 25 miles an hour, and I measured that stopping distance with a quote-unquote normal rotor temperature. And there was quite a drastic difference between a hot rotor and a cold rotor when it came to this light pedal pressure stopping distance. So with all that in mind, guys, we're gonna really dive in and start taking a deep dive into the numbers that I got here. All right, so the first thing we're gonna talk about here is gonna be panic stopping distance. So looking at this top chart that you see here on the screen, these are the average panic stopping distances with each brake pad I tested at 50 miles an hour. So I did 5 panic stops at 50 miles an hour, took the average of those 5, and that is the data that you're seeing at the top on this chart. So overall, the pad with the shortest stopping distance over 5 stops was the Wagner OEX pad, and the pad with the worst stopping distance, or the longest stopping distance, was going to be the AutoShack $20 Amazon pads. Those are all the way out at 84 feet. And if you do the math on that, that's roughly a 14-foot difference between an AutoShack pad and the Wagner OEX, or that's about the length of a Honda Fit. That's one car length of a small car from 50 miles an hour. So if you were to increase this speed to say 60 or 70, which I couldn't do because I didn't have a closed course where I could run that sort of speed, but those distance discrepancies that you see between the cheap pads and the expensive pads, it's going to get larger and larger the higher the speeds go. The other big takeaway that you need to take a look at here is largely if you're buying a name brand set of pads, the stopping distances, guys, are within about 4 feet of one another. So if you're buying a name brand set of pads here, frankly, by and large, you're going to get good results. Now, when you take a look at this bottom chart, what this bottom chart is showing you is the bottom chart shows the speed that I was going when I initiated all of the panic stops above. So for example, the Wagner OEX, on average, I was going 48.8 miles an hour when I initiated the panic stop to achieve that 70-foot distance. So this is showing you some of my variability here. And what you need to understand here is if you take a look at everything I have listed as far as the speeds when the stops were initiated, on a traditional vehicle speedometer, they're all going to show 49 miles an hour with exception of the Raybestos MGD. That is going to show 48. I'm showing you 2 decimal places after the actual speed. There is no speedometer on the market that I'm aware of that'll show you a single decimal point. So I can get extremely, extremely precise using the data from this iDash. So when you really start looking at the stopping distances here, you can see there are some variations in the speed. So like, for example, the Bosch Quiet Cast, I initiated the stops at 49 miles an hour. And if you look at that stopping distance, it's 74 feet. Well, if you take a look at the Bosch Blue, I initiated that at 48.6. So the discrepancy that you're seeing between the Bosch Blue and the Bosch Quiet Cast could probably be accounted for in simply the speed that I initiated the two different stops with the two different sets of pads. And you could say the exact same thing about the AC Delco Advantage and the Raybestos MGD. On average, my average speed when I initiated the stops between those two pads, it's almost a 1 mile an hour difference. And if you do the math, it's a 1.3 foot difference in stopping distance on average over 5 stops. Well, you can account for that 1.3 feet with the difference in speed when I initiated the stop. So this is where like I said, I can get super deep into this and really start splitting hairs because I'm honestly giving you guys what my variability was throughout this whole test. So looking at this graph I have on the screen, this I think tells a much clearer picture of the overall performance of these pads. So the blue bars that you see on this graph are the exact same distances of what I just showed you on the prior one. The difference is the green bars are the average of the first 2 panic stops, and the gray bars are the average of the last 2 panic stops. So what this is doing is this is telling you the stopping distance with a set of cold rotors versus the panic stopping distance with a set of hot rotors. So if the brakes are cold, how do they perform? And if the brakes are hot, how do they perform? And if you notice the Wagners, the further you get to the left on this chart, the more consistent the two distances are from one another. The more that you deviate to the right on this chart, the more that you see there's a lot of variation from the first 2 stops versus the last 2 stops. And I want to say, the biggest offender here really is the PowerStop Z23 carbon pads. So these pads are actually marketed as a performance brake pad. And looking at these stopping distances, they perform like a performance brake pad. So what that means is they have to get up to temperature for them to work correctly. So if you look at that green bar on the PowerStop Z23, that's 82 feet. Well, the first initial stop with the AutoShack pads that I bought for $20, that was only 79 feet. The PowerStops from cold are worse than the $20 AutoShack pads. But when they're hot, they're better than every other pad here by a couple of feet. So this is why, putting a performance pad on a daily driver doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. It honestly depends on how you're using the vehicle. And if you're, going up and down a lot of hills and really riding the brakes, or you like to drive in a spirited manner, sure, the performance pads do make sense. But if you're just going to drive the vehicle, hours and hours and hours on the freeway and then maybe have to make a panic stop at a construction zone, there's far better choices here than what these PowerStops are. So hopefully this chart gives you a lot more information than what that last one did. Now, the other thing that you guys need to consider here with these stopping distances that I'm showing you are the tires on the vehicle. Think about it for a second. Take a Formula One car that has probably the most exotic brake setup out of any vehicle on the planet. As far as a high-performance brake system, it doesn't get any more high performance than that. Well, take that Formula One car and put it on a sheet of ice. Really doesn't matter how good the brakes are if the tires don't have any traction with the pavement. So in the stopping distances that I showed you, yeah, I could probably change those stopping distances a little bit with a high performance set of tires. But it's the exact same argument as what I showed you guys with the performance brake pads. If you don't get a performance tire up to temperature, it's not going to grip the pavement nearly as well as a standard tire that is designed for the application. So the tires that I have on this vehicle, they are Nexen N5000 Plus tires. I believe they are 60,000 mile tires. They have an A traction rating, nothing exotic at all. You know, very, very standard tires on a very, very standard car. So just be aware, your results may vary depending on the tires that you have on the vehicle. So now what I want to show you guys is I'm going to show you guys the average ABS activation pressure for each pad with each panic stop. At what pressure in the caliper does the ABS actually kick in? All right, so the chart that I have on the screen is showing the average ABS activation pressure for each one of these pads, the average for that over the 5 panic stops. So if I took the ABS activation pressure for every one of the panic stops and averaged it out for each one of the pads, and these are the numbers that I came up with. And you can see they're all largely between 13 and 1500, somewhere in that neighborhood. There are a couple outliers, the main outlier being the AutoShack pads from Amazon. And in my opinion, the reason for that is the AutoShack pads simply do not develop as much stopping bite or as much friction as the rest of the pads in this group. I'm able to put more pressure into the brake pedal without the wheel locking up because the pad is not able to aggressively grab at the rotor like it is with some of these other pads. The other one that's kind of strange to me is the GM Genuine, the Akebono pad. And frankly, I'm not really sure what went on there. If you look, it has a pretty low activation pressure for the ABS system at just over 1200 PSI. And the only thing that makes sense to me is maybe there was some gravel on the road causing the wheel to lock up. To me, that's the only thing that really makes sense because the Akebono pads show a very, very low activation pressure for the ABS, but actually had one of the longer stopping distances in the test. And the only thing I can attribute it to is the lack of traction on the tire with the pavement. Now, it just so happened that in the middle of all this testing, well, one day it rained. And what I wanted to do for you guys is just show you guys the exact same pads in the dry versus in the wet. What is the difference in stopping distance between those two different scenarios, dry pavement versus wet pavement? So taking a look at the chart I have here on the screen, you can see the wet stopping distance there in green, and it added roughly 5 to 6 feet versus a dry stop with the same pads. I only did this with the Raybestos, the lower tier Raybestos, the MGD or their R line. I'm not sure what exactly they call it. But at any rate, you can see even the Raybestos pads in the wet were better than the AutoShack Amazon pads in the dry. Now, the final thing that I took a look at on this 50-mile test loop is initial bite. Now, the way that I was sort of able to quantify initial bite was what I did was I essentially took the vehicle, drove it at 25 miles an hour, and I applied the brakes with a very light amount of pedal pressure and then measured the amount of stopping distance that I had. So what I did was I ran the vehicle up 25 miles an hour, came up on my 0 foot marker, and then immediately I tried to apply the brakes at 350 PSI. I held the brakes at 350 PSI as best as I could until the vehicle stopped. I did this 2 different ways. So I did this hot after the 5 panic stops with each pad. So on a hot set of rotors, how well does that pad have initial bite? You know, is it very, very aggressive on the initial bite with hot rotors? And then the other way that I took a look at it was after I got back to my house, essentially, I did the exact same test with a quote unquote normal temperature rotor. And with the normal temperature rotor, I took the average of 3. So that is what we're going to take a look at now. Okay, so the 2 charts that you're seeing on the screen sort of go hand in hand with one another. And I want to start out with the chart that you see on the top, because once you understand what's going on in the chart in the top, the chart at the bottom is going to probably make more sense. So starting out over here on the far left with the Wagner OEX, what I did, that blue line that you see, is the stopping distance, an average of 3 stops with 352 pounds of pedal pressure. I was able to get that vehicle stopped in approximately 156 feet from 25 miles an hour. Now, when you look at the green bar right next to it, when I did the exact same test, that stopping distance went all the way down to 124 feet. So this is visually showing you how much difference there is in initial bite, because again, this is very, very hard to convey on video, but now I have physical data to actually show you what's going on here. So overall, the pad with the highest level of initial bite is going to be the AC Delco Professional. I was able to get this vehicle stopped with cold rotors with an average of 3 stops at 368 PSI of pressure in 120 feet. When I went to a set of hot rotors, it stopped in 101 feet. So that is going to be the pad in this test with the highest level of initial bite. The other pad that I want to make note of here is going to be the PowerStop Z23. If you look at the stopping distance from cold, you can see when they're cold, they do not have a large level of initial bite. You know, it was all the way out at 148 feet when the rotors were cold. But once those rotors were hot, those pads had a great level of initial bite. I got that stopping distance down with a set of hot rotors on initial bite all the way down to 105 feet. So you can see just how much variation there is overall in the way those brakes feel just by based on looking at the difference between the cold rotor stopping distance and the hot rotor stopping distance with the same pedal pressure. When you go down to this bottom graph down here, what you have to understand about this type of testing that I'm showing you with these two graphs is a lot of this is dependent on my skill, right? Because I have to generate 350 PSI of caliper pressure instantaneously. If I do it in a very linear fashion, it'll change that stopping distance. Just like when you do a panic stop and you stand on those brakes immediately and generate a ton of pressure instantaneously, I need to be able to generate 350 PSI of pressure instantaneously. And the issue is with that, you can generate about 350 PSI in about a ½ inch worth of pedal travel. So I'm driving 25 miles an hour and I have to instantly move my foot about a ½ inch on that pedal to generate that 350 PSI. So this bottom chart, what it's actually showing you, it's the average peak pressure for the stops that are listed above it. So the Wagner OEX, I was able to average 352 PSI across those stops that you see above. Whereas like the PowerStop Z17 ceramic, on average, I held it at 400 PSI. So like I said, there is some variability in this test because of the human error portion of it. But my thing is, if I just supply you with enough data, you should be able to make determinations as to what you want and what you don't, and what sort of initial bite is good and what is bad, provided enough data. Now at this point, there's still all sorts of data that I could just throw at you guys to try and build a story here, but the fact of the matter is, the more that I just bombard you guys with information from this point forward, I don't think it's really going to change anything. So what I mean is I could go through and I could calculate the amount of G-force that I experienced on every one of those panic stops for every pad here. I could go through and I could calculate the amount of force on the brake pad against the rotor in this brake system because I have that brake pressure information. Again, I don't think that's really going to change anything that you've seen, because at this point I feel as though I have my mind made up. You guys probably already have your mind made up, but just know there's all sorts of information that I could continue to bombard you with, but at the end of the day, I really don't think it's going to change anything. So just a couple like little interesting facts about that testing that I just showed you. I calculated and I added up every single panic stop that I did to this car for every single pad here. And if you do the math on that and add all those distances up, I panic stopped this car for over 5,000 feet to create this video. So it's, like I said, there was a bunch of testing that went into this. I have 154 data logs from this car for all the different pads here. Every single data log is a different stop. That doesn't include the work that went into changing all the different brake pads. That doesn't include the hour-and-a-half round trip it took on that test drive. So just the test drives alone, I've got 18 hours just in test drives and measuring stopping distances. That doesn't include video creating time, that doesn't include editing time, and that doesn't include the time it took to do the brake jobs. So if you guys would just interact with this video in some way, shape, or form, go down, hit the like button, hit the dislike button, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, whatever you want to do, I would appreciate it, because as I just broke down for you, there was an absolute boatload of work that went into this video. So now the next thing I want to look at is how much brake dust did each one of these pads produce. Now, in order to be able to compare this, what I did was I took a piece of roughly like 2-inch wide masking tape and I put it across the barrel of the wheel and down onto the face of the wheel. So as I did all of these panic stops and drove around, that tape that was spinning around the wheel was collecting the brake dust from all those panic stops and as the vehicle was being driven on that test route. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you guys over to the bench and we're going to take a look at all these different pieces of tape that are loaded full of brake dust. All right, so over here at the bench, these are all of the brake dust samples that I have from all of this testing. So what I did was I took each piece of tape and I attached it to a piece of printer paper, and then down at the bottom of the piece of printer paper, I just put a blank untested piece of tape as a control. So now you have a point of reference as to how much dust each set of pads creates. So starting out here, when you look at each one of these sheets, from roughly this point to the left is what you're going to see on the face of the wheel. So if you kind of notice, there's a clean spot on all of these in the same location because these were all in the same portion of the wheel. This portion that you see over here to the right, this is going to be what was in the barrel of the wheel, inside the rim where you can't necessarily see. So most of your attention should be focused over here on the left, because that is ultimately what you're actually going to see as far as brake dust on your wheels. Now, taking a look at everything I have here on this sheet, this is the GM Genuine Akebono pads here, the AutoShack pads, and the PowerStop Z23. Out of these 3 pads that I have on this sheet, the AutoShack pads are the cleanest. I would say the GM Genuine pads, the Akebono pads, these have the most brake dust of anything on this sheet. So when I go over to the next sheet, you've got the PowerStop Z17 ceramic, the Bosch Blue, and then the Bosch Quiet Cast. The Bosch Blue is going to have the least amount of brake dust of the 3 that are on this sheet. Some of this staining that you see, I think this is grease from the brake system, because by this point in the test, I had tested, 6 or 8 pads at this point, and what you're seeing is you're seeing some of that grease come out of those slide pins because the brakes, again, were so hot. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to some of this blotchiness and some of this grease that you see over here on the right. Mostly just pay attention to what you see here on the left. And like I said, the Bosch Blue of the 3 that are on this sheet seems to be the cleanest. Moving over here to the next sheet, I have the AC Delco Professional, the Raybestos MGD, and the Raybestos Element 3s. And the Raybestos Element 3 of the 3 here is going to be the cleanest, followed by the AC Delco Professional, and then the Raybestos MGD bringing up the rear on this sheet. The last sheet here, I've got the Wagner OEX, the Wagner QS, and the AC Delco Advantage. And looking at this sheet, they're all pretty darn similar here. There aren't huge differences between this tier. The only thing that I will tell you is the Wagner OEX, you'll actually, if you look closely, you'll see the top one here appears worse than the one below it. And there's a reason for that. So let me get into that for just a second. Now, when you stop and take a look at the Wagner OEX pads that I pulled off of the car and the rotor, well, the difference in brake dust from this test tape sample to this sample starts to make sense. So if you stop and look at the pads, you can plainly see that this brake pad had a taper to it. So this bottom section of the brake pad in that 50-mile test, including all of the stopping tests that I did, this bottom section of the pad never touched the rotor. You can clearly see on the outer edge of this rotor here where this section of the pad was making contact with the rotor, And clearly the bottom portion of the pad wasn't touching the rotor at all. This was only present on this one pad from Wagner, and you can plainly see the issue here. If you take this pad and flip it on its side like this and look at it across the face, this pad had a taper. So instead of these two surfaces being perfectly square with the rotor, the pad surface was like this. So only this outer section was making contact with that square rotor, and that's what you get. The unfortunate side of this to me is this is Wagner's most premium pad that they offer. And this is the only pad in this entire test that had any type of quality control issues. That includes the $20 Auto Shack pads. The $20 Auto Shack pads didn't have any pad taper problems like this. So even when I went down to Wagner's lower tier line, again, there were no pad taper problems like this. Overall, it just makes me question Wagner's quality control as a whole. So overall, what do I think has the least amount of brake dust? Well, it's probably going to be the Wagner QS, the Raybestos Element 3s. Those are good as well. You can see, you know, from here to here, those are very close. It's probably, the Wagners are probably a little bit better. The Bosch Blues are good. The Bosch Blues are probably going to be on the same tier as what the Wagners are. And from there down, you know, it's really going to be dependent on how much brake dust you're going to deal with. Probably the worst set here is going to be the Raybestos MGDs, the low tier Raybestos pads and the GM OEM pads. They're both pretty bad. Actually, the GM OEM pads look to be a little bit worse than what the Raybestos pads do here. So that's how all the pads sort of stack up, guys. You know, everything else is fairly average. I've used the PowerStop Z17 on my own vehicles, and I would say those are slightly better than average than some of these other ones that I've tested here. By and large, you know, I know that this is a huge factor for a lot of different people. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get you guys hopefully like close-up pictures of each one of these. So if you guys want to, you know, pause the video and take a look at how each one of these compared to one another, you're more than welcome to do that. The thing is, to me, I would rather have better stopping distance, low noise, and a long life, and sacrifice a little bit of brake dust for that. But everybody's priorities are a little bit different. So the final thing we're going to test here in this video is going to be corrosion resistance of each one of these pads and the hardware. Now, to test the corrosion resistance of the pads themselves, back here in the back corner of my garage, I have a plastic storage tote. So inside this plastic storage tote, if I pull the lid here, inside you can see I have a salt fog going. So this is a 5% salt solution, and in this tote I have all of the hardware. Underneath it is the pads, and they've been in here for about 172 hours, so just over a week at this point. So in the bottom of this tote, once this fog sort of clears out of here a little bit, there's 2 Halloween misters. So there's one here, and there's another one right there. So these are the misters that you see in Halloween decorations, and it just creates this fog. In the bottom of the tote is 2 gallons of salt water with 5% salt in it. And in addition to that, there's also an aquarium heater heating up the water to about 100 degrees. So let me go ahead and pull the milk crate. So this is the hardware on top. We'll take a look at that separately. And underneath is going to be all of the pads. So let me pull these out, take them over to the bench, and we're going to look at each one of these pads individually to see how well they held up over a week in this salt spray. All right, so over here at the bench, I've got all the pads taken out of the salt fog chamber. We're going to go through each one of these individually. Just for reference, guys, I have the pad above that was not in the salt fog, and the pad on the bottom was. So these were in for 172 hours, every single one of these, just over a week. And we're gonna go through and see how they hold up. So, starting out over here on the far left with the GM genuine brake pads made by Akebono. Honestly, they're fairly standard. They're not anything crazy as far as corrosion resistance is concerned. I think personally, they seem to be pretty middle of the road. You can see right where that friction material meets the backing plate. There is some rust forming in there, but all in all, they're not bad. There are some better things here though. Next one here is gonna be the Auto Shack pads from Amazon. And what I found very, very unique about these is there was virtually no rust on the backing plate, but the friction material didn't seem to hold up very well at all. So believe it or not, the friction material is rusting faster than the backing plate. Seems really, really odd to me. There must be a lot of metallic material in this backing plate for that to rust up like that, but at any rate, that's the result. So moving on to these next four here. So we got the two from AC Delco and the two from Raybestos. Looking at these pads side by side, guys, I am 99% sure that Raybestos is the supplier for these AC Delco pads that I have in this test. So if you look at the higher tier AC Delco pad and compare it to the higher tier Raybestos pad, they're virtually identical as far as corrosion is concerned. The reason that I started to notice that this is probably made by Raybestos is when I looked at the two lower tier Raybestos pads and the AC Delco lower tier pad. Look at the formatting of the code on both of these pads. It's identical. So that tells me that these two pads have to come out of the same factory. There's no way that there's two different factories in China that just by coincidence have the exact same type of code and code format and code placement on brake pads. I find that extremely hard to believe. So from what I can gather here, the AC Delco pads appear to be made by Raybestos. So when you take a look at the overall corrosion resistance, they're pretty darn similar to one another. So that is going to be the upper tier AC Delco. This is going to be the upper tier Raybestos pad, and frankly, there isn't much difference between the two. Now, I do have some experience with Raybestos pads, specifically the Element 3s. I put a set of Element 3 Raybestos pads on my wife's Escape about 3 years ago, and about 2 years ago, the backing plates had fallen off the friction material, or vice versa, depending on how you want to look at it, and the brakes started squealing like mad. So these would not be very great at corrosion resistance based on my own personal experience. I only got a year or two out of these in northeastern Ohio before the friction material fell off the backing plate. Moving over to the lower tier, you can see even the lower tier AC Delco and Raybestos, again, you know, the way that they're corroded is very, very similar. And believe it or not, it seems as though the lower tier AC Delco and lower tier Raybestos have less corrosion on them than the higher end version. So frankly, unless you want, you know, a smaller amount of brake dust, less brake dust, in my eyes, guys, there's really no reason to go out and shell out additional money on the upper tier Raybestos pads, because frankly, these are stopped just as well. They give decent initial bite, and frankly, they're more corrosion resistant than what the upper tier is. So the next one here is going to be PowerStop, and the PowerStop pads appear to be pretty similar between their lower tier ceramic and then their more premium high performance version, their carbon hybrid ceramic or whatever the heck they call it. So yeah, those are pretty similar. I've ran the Z17s on multiple vehicles now, and I've had good luck with them. I've had better luck with the Z17s resisting corrosion than what I have with the Raybestos Element 3s, and the salt fog test is pretty indicative of that. You can plainly see, you know, there's less corrosion on these Z17s from CarbonStop than what there is on the Element 3s from Raybestos. So moving on to the Bosch, and honestly guys, I think the Bosch pads in this test are going to be the most corrosion resistant out of anything you're going to find. Looking at the pads themselves, it's pretty darn hard to tell that these pads were even in that salt fog chamber for a week. You could see on the shim there where the shim is riveted to the backing plate, yeah, there's a little bit of rust on there, but as far as the backing plate itself, there's very, very little rust on that backing plate overall. Even on the lower tier pad, the lower tier pad is largely in the exact same condition. So it's kind of like the same argument that you can make with Raybestos. I really don't see a tangible reason why somebody would buy the higher tier Bosch pad versus the lower tier, because performance-wise, they seem virtually identical from everything that I've tested. Now the final two pads here are going to be from Wagner. The lower tier Wagner pad was actually much better than the Wagner OEX, which is their upper tier. So this has a painted backing plate, bonded friction material with just glue. Nothing exotic here. This is, like I said, their lower tier pad line from Wagner. When you move over to the Wagner OEX, this had the most corrosion of the backing plate out of anything in the test. And it's honestly kind of sad because, well, they claim that this was a galvanized backing plate, and frankly, it might have been a galvanized backing plate, but at the end of the day, it did not hold up nearly as well as a lot of the different backing plates that were in this test. You know, even coming down and looking at the auto shacks by and large are probably just as corrosion resistant as what these fancy high-end Wagners are with this galvanized backing plate, you know, the mechanical attachment and the whole nine. Frankly, if you're looking purely on corrosion resistance, my pick is going to be the two Bosch pads out of all of these. So taking a look at all the hardware, guys, honestly, you're going to have far more issues with the backing plates than what you're going to have with any of this hardware. The biggest one that changed was the Akebono. There's no corrosion on it. It simply just changed color. So I don't know if they have some sort of zinc plating, but kind of going down the line here real quick, you could see like that one there from AC Delco, that's probably the largest amount of rust that I saw in a week. And the pad looked like this. So like I said, you're gonna have far more issues with the pad than what you're gonna have with the hardware, because frankly, all this hardware held up perfectly fine for a week. So before we get into the final results, guys, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of my own opinion and some of my own personal experience with some of the pads that I have sitting here on the bench, because I have used some of these pads in my own personal vehicle, and some of these pads here I have used for tens of thousands of miles, and I do in fact have a long-term opinion on it. You know, a lot of the pads here I do not have long-term experience with. So I would ask you guys, if you guys have any sort of long-term data or long-term experience with any of these pads, please let me know down in the comment section what you've had success with and what you haven't. So the pads that I have used personally and I have had good success with, it's going to be the PowerStop Z17, the lower end PowerStop pad. I have used that pad on, I think, 3 different vehicles now that I personally own. I only own 5 vehicles, and 3 of my 5 vehicles have those pads on it. Frankly, they give you a low amount of noise, low amount of brake dust. They seem to have reasonable life, reasonable corrosion resistance, and they seem to be at a lower price point than a lot of the other pads in this test. Just to give you an example, like I found these PowerStop pads for this Chevy Cruze, I want to say it was less than $30 online, depending on where you're buying it from. So they're reasonably cheap. They have a decent life. They're fairly quiet, fairly low as far as the amount of dust that they produce, and they seem to be fairly corrosion resistant. Overall, if you're on a budget, I highly recommend, you know, looking at that pad. The other pad that I have personal experience with here is going to be the Raybestos Element 3. I put a set of Raybestos Element 3 pads on my wife's Escape it's a little over 3 years ago at this point, and the video is actually on YouTube of me doing the brake job on my wife's Escape. I put the Raybestos pads on her Escape, and roughly about 2 years after I performed that brake job, the friction material had fallen off the backing plate, the brakes were squealing like mad, but when you go in there and look at it with a flashlight and try to see what was going on, everything appeared to be fine because there was plenty of friction material between the rotor and the backing plate. The thing is, when that friction material falls off the backing plate, generally there isn't enough room between the backing plate and the rotor for that friction material to fall out completely. So usually what happens is if that friction material falls off the backing plate, the brakes will start squealing like mad, and that was what happened to my wife. So I went to pull the brakes apart this summer. I didn't record it because I had already shot another brake job on a Ford Escape, but I pulled the brakes apart this summer and they literally just fell apart when I pulled the calipers off. So I put the Z17 pads on her Escape this past summer, probably in like June or so. It's been fine so far, but again, it hasn't gone through winter yet, and it's only been about 6 months. She's probably put about 5,000 miles on those pads since I put them on. But like I said, I've got those pads on my Mustang. For a street pad, they work great. I also have them on my Honda Fit because they're cheap. And again, I haven't had any issues with them at all. So if you guys have any other opinions of the pads themselves, any long-term information, like do any of these squeal, you know, after 10,000 miles, let me know down in the comments, because that is probably the biggest Achilles heel that I have with this video, is I simply cannot run 12 different pads for 10,000 miles in order to create one YouTube video. It's just, for one person, it's simply not feasible. All right, so what are the big takeaways here? And when I really sat down and started really getting deep and doing a bunch of analysis on all this different testing that I did, what I quickly realized and sort of found out is it doesn't really seem as though buying the more premium brake pad from a manufacturer versus the low-end brake pad from the same manufacturer doesn't really seem like it makes any sense. Like, so for example, if you were to go to Raybestos and you want to buy the MGD, the low-end pad, or you want to go buy that high-end pad, performance-wise, as far as stopping distance, corrosion resistance, things like that, they appear to be largely the same. There may be some differences in the amount of brake dust that they produce, but as far as how safe they are, I really don't see huge differences. When you start to see differences in this video is when you start comparing different manufacturers to one another. So for example, like if you took Raybestos and compared the Raybestos line to the Bosch line versus the Wagner line, yes, then you can see some separation. But as far as like a high-end pad versus a low-end pad from the same manufacturer, really doesn't seem like there's massive differences here with all the data that I collected. Now, the other thing that may be a factor for a lot of different people is where all of these brake pads are actually manufactured. So the Akebono GM Genuine brake pads, those are made in USA. All of the other brake pads here are either made in China, Mexico, or India, depending on the manufacturer and what grade they are. So I know like the high-end, the Element 3 Raybestos pad, those are made in India, whereas the low-end Raybestos pad for the same car, those are made in China. So it really is going to depend on, you know, what manufacturer you're looking at, what tier you're looking at, things like that. But by and large, like if you're just looking for a very safe option, I'm going to steer you toward Akebono. I understand, you know, the performance overall wasn't staggering as far as stopping distance and things like that, but if GM is willing to put those pads on a car from the factory, well, generally speaking, you could pretty much assure that it's not going to squeal in 20,000 miles, and they're going to hold up a reasonable amount of time. I think for me personally, one of the biggest disappointments in this test was the Wagner OEX. You know, they claimed that that has a mechanical backing plate, which it may, but they also claimed it has a galvanized backing plate, which it may, but the fact of the matter is it rusted more quickly than any other brake pad in this test. And this is also the only brake pad that had any sort of quality control issues if you go back and watch some of that footage when I talked about the brake pad or the brake dust testing. So overall, guys, I think there's a lot of good options here. And what I'm gonna do for you guys is I'm gonna put links in the description to each manufacturer's Amazon page. So if you guys wanna go buy a set of brake pads, I'll get a commission on it. I would appreciate it. And the nice thing is for you, your cost is the same whether you follow my links or you just go to Amazon organically and buy the pads. Either way, you know, your cost is gonna be the same. And if you buy the brake pads or any other item on Amazon after clicking one of my links, I'll get a percentage of it. So I would highly appreciate it. If you guys wanna support the channel, that is the best way to do it, because you get something out of it, I get something out of it, and the brake pad manufacturer gets a sale from it. Everybody kind of wins. So that is why I like using affiliate links. With that, guys, like I said, I will have links in the description to all the different Amazon stores for all the brake pads I tested here. As always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.